Thank you, Charles. Thanks for having me, everybody. I got in at 1 o'clock last night, so if I seem a little out of it, I probably am. So I also thought I was going to be talking for an hour. It looks like it's more like 45 minutes, so my slide deck is probably a little too long. So I'm going to be going probably pretty fast, which is okay because I talk a little too fast anyway. So the empowering of the American mind, 10 principles for healthier K-12 education. So I always like to start, this is the way I start my talks whenever I speak at high schools or unfortunately now on campuses. How do we handle dissenters in human history? We make them drink hemlock, burn them at the stake, that's Giordano Bruno in 1600, and we crucify them. We don't handle people who dissent with us very well, and this is most of human history and most human societies. You can see the way this works when you look anywhere outside of the United States, where people are put in jail for saying they don't believe in God, for spreading information about the coronavirus early on. The person in the middle died from it, for singing rude songs. That's a Pussy Riot in Russia. And this is why I call freedom of speech the eternally radical idea. It's not a conservative idea, it's not a liberal idea. It's a society that is radical because in every generation people rise up to oppose it. And any idea that is opposed in every decade, every year of human civilization is a radical idea. It doesn't belong with conservative, it doesn't belong with liberal. And really for most of history, freedom of speech was barely a thing. And it's rare, and it's fragile, and it's endangered more than I've seen it for most of my life. So this is the fundamental misunderstanding of free speech that I feel like it's being taught in high schools today. Free speech is the argument of the bully, the bigot, and the robber baron. Now, this comes from the fact that we don't have, come from a fairly simple fact. We don't have a lot of viewpoint diversity among K-12 teachers, and we have almost none among campus administrators, and surprisingly little among the professorate. And when you're in power, when your opinions are close to power or liked by power, freedom of speech starts to seem like a threat, not something that actually advances human progress. And that's the way power always sees freedom of speech. The only thing that's funny in this case is that in higher education, they like to think of themselves as the weak ones, as the underdogs with $50 billion in the bank, for example, thinking of one college. And it's one of these bubbles we have to pop, basically saying, no, you are actually representing conformity and power in this situation. And freedom of speech exists specifically to protect minorities. Now, what do I mean by saying this? Well, for example, with the robber baron, wealth and power have always been protected in human society by wealth and power. They kind of protect themselves. By the time you get to democracies, the will of the people, as long as you had 51% of the vote, you got to make the rules. You only had to have freedom of speech, both as a legal concept and as a cultural concept, to protect minority points of view, because everyone else is protected either by the vote or by being popular with the powerful or being the rich and powerful themselves. So it's no mistake that Ida B. Wells, her newspaper was called Freedom of Speech. Frederick Douglass is one of our great thinkers on freedom of speech. Nelson Mandela and Gandhi both wrote about the importance of freedom of speech, which a lot of people don't know. John Lewis, who actually lived right in my neighborhood, talked about if it wasn't for the First Amendment, the civil rights movement would have been a bird without wings. And he passed in 2020. And the person right in the middle that you probably don't know about is the great Frank Kameny, a supporter of freedom of speech and one of the leading lights in the gay rights movement. And he's someone that more people should know his name. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about how I got into this business and about what I see on campus. I'm a First Amendment lawyer. I've probably been doing more psychology than law for a couple of years now. I started working at Fire in 2001 as the first legal director. And even back in 2001, I was shocked at how easy it is to get in trouble for what you say on campus. And it has gotten a great deal worse. So Haidt and I noticed, actually I brought this to Haidt's attention, Jonathan Haidt's a sociologist that I did my book, Coddling the American Mind with. He's awesome. But in 2013, like lightning struck, there was this major change on campus. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't gradual. Suddenly, students were showing up, not just demanding new speech restrictions, they were demanding them framed as a health necessity, for psychological health, which I knew was wrong, which led me to working with Haidt, because my argument was essentially, these aren't just bad for freedom of speech and academic freedom, these are bad for the individual students who believe them, mental health. If you tell them to and I'm going to get to a little bit more of this in my presentation, and I'll explain more what I mean. But, so it was already pretty bad in 2014, and 2015 got worse. And in 2017, I saw the largest scale violence that I'd seen in my career. The riots at Berkeley were no joke, and of course the people who were actually harmed in them were not even fans of Milo Yiannopoulos. They were reporters, checking out student reporters in some cases. And you know, they're very lucky that no one was killed during those riots, because it wasn't for lack of trying. On the other side, there's Allison Stanger at Middlebury. She was the professor she's a liberal professor, but she was permanently injured, badly hurt, while defending Charles Murray, someone she'd invited to school to debate. She's a wonderful and forgiving person. And Heather McDonald below her had a situation at Claremont McKenna where she went to give a speech about how stigmatizing police could lead to an uptick in crime. She came out with a book about this in 2015. And students wouldn't let people get to her talk. They barricaded the doors, they physically blocked it. It's one of the cases that people know less about. The good news there is that Claremont McKenna redeemed itself after this incident in a very big way. So the scariest thing about what happened at Berkeley, and we explain this much better in the book, Coddling the American Mind, was that students came out in defense of the students. It wasn't as if there was no violence previously on campus related to speakers. Just generally, once people caught their breath and caught up a little bit, they would say, wow, we don't want to be those people. Jon Stewart, made fun of students who did these back in the 2000s. But in 2017, everything was different. And student after student jumped to the defense of the use of violence as a form of self-defense for speech, which was itself violence, without seeming to realize that if your speech is violence to me and I can respond violently, they can just as easily say the same thing. Or they can say just we respond to violence with violence, just in self-defense, that just leads to a downward spiral. And it's not as if legal thinkers haven't thought of this one before. Free speech, yes, as being an important distinction between freedom of speech from the expression of opinion and violence. It's a social construct. It's something that people came up with. But it's one of the best inventions for peace and innovation that's ever been tried. So Sam Abrams, he's a friend, but he had students vandalizing his door after he came out in the New York Times explaining that as far left as the professoriate leans, administrators are even more monolithic. This is something that I thought, anybody who knows the field, should be uncontroversial. But nonetheless, students targeted him to try to get him fired from Sarah Lawrence for publishing this article, which kind of shows that since there was nothing in it about students, that the administrators were telling students, go try to get this whistleblower out of our way. So, and of course, we end up with situations where the conservatives get in the act. And this doesn't make the situation for free speech, better. It makes it far, far worse. And we've seen this, particularly since 2014, professors getting fired and students targeted when they say things that get into the right-wing media. In some cases, people saying very innocent things. In some cases, people saying obnoxious things, but nonetheless protected. Babson College, this one is amazing. This professor was fired after sending this tweet, if you can read it for yourself. The claim was that he was advising the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was long dead, to bomb the United States in all seriousness. And as soon as this got out, he was fired. And this is one of the cases that happened before the huge spike of cases that we saw in 2017. Oh, and FIRE defends everybody. We're a politically diverse organization, and we're unapologetic defenders of free speech, no matter where it falls in the spectrum. You probably know about the Brett Weinstein case. If you don't, you can either read about it in Coddling, or you can look up videos for it. It's amazing because it's kind of like a master class on censorship coming from all directions and how bad it can actually look. And this is a kind of crazy case. This is a case where a professor in a discrimination class self-censored in order to have a real-world scenario on a law school exam. He self-censored the use of slurs by he presented them literally this way, with the dashes after them, even though it was standard practice prior to that to just say the word. There was a distinction between use and mention. Like calling someone an epithet's one thing, but talking about it in an academic setting was always considered to be okay. But here he went the extra step to even censor it on the exam, but because it reminded students of those words, he was nonetheless punished for having this as part of a question. And it's kind of hard to have a class on discrimination where you don't actually talk about real-world scenarios, which involve epithets. And now cancel culture. I don't know if you're familiar with Titania McGrath. Is Andrew Doyle? Is that his first name? Yeah, it's a made-up character, but I've always thought this explains the attitude about cancel culture. Cancel culture is, of course, a real thing. It depends on what term you use, but we saw an explosion of it in 2020 in particular. So in 2020, we thought it was going to be a quiet year at FIRE. Made sense. We work on campus, and 80% of campuses are shut down. Like we thought it was going to be slow, and we were a little bit wrong. As you can see, those big bars are the number of case submissions we had in those months compared to what we had in previous years. June is usually a pretty quiet month. We had 4 times as many cases as we would normally have in 2020 alone. We recently just revealed our scholar database, talking about professors being targeted for cancellation on campus. That explains it. We found 426 instances since 2015. There's been an effort to say, oh, that's nothing. And it's like, I think people are under the impression that there are like 60,000 schools in the country, because really there's about 400 that about 70% of the population attends, only about 600 that 80% of the population attends. And when you break this down into, about 3/4 result in punishment, and we saw 113 just in 2020. And this includes tenured professors getting fired. More than 24 tenured professors getting fired. That was unheard of, and we still have people dismissing this. So to put it in context, Harvard, which I've already pretty much mentioned, had something like 9 incidents of professors being targeted since 2015. 5 of them, I believe, resulted in some kind of punishment or termination. And this is a school that has about 1,000 tenured professors. You're not going to expect a adjunct professor to show any amount of bravery. I do when I teach adjunct, but that's because, what, you're going to fire me? Like, this is what I do for a living. So our 2021 free speech rankings, these include surveys of, we evaluate university speech codes, we evaluate their, we actually are able to talk to their students directly about what they think about the atmosphere for free speech is. Somewhat to our surprise, Claremont McKenna was #1 this year, and DePaul University, for the 2nd year in a row, was dead last. So, coddling the American mind. That's actually my son Maxwell. This was actually supposed to be a different picture, but he's very cute. So I came out with, I wrote an article called Coddling the American Mind with Jonathan Haidt back in 2015, several years before the book. And one of the theories that I mentioned before was that the same habits that make students want to censor are the same habits that will make you anxious and depressed. And we thought we'd see some kind of modest blip, some modest dip in depression, increase in depression and anxiety. And instead, we saw depression and anxiety double in some cases. And it just kept on going. Because when we wrote it in 2015, the evidence wasn't in yet, but the rate had doubled or tripled. It gets worse when you look into suicides. One of the little dashed line, that's where what the data was as of us writing the book. And the data actually got much worse for men. after the book came out, as you can see, for suicides. Interestingly, morbidly interesting, but true, is that men and women attempt to kill themselves at about the same rate, with actually more attempts usually by women. But the reason why there's such a disparity in that is because men tend to jump off buildings and shoot themselves, whereas women tend to use overdoses, which are much easier for people to survive. Suicides, and this is the one that kills me. Suicides for ages 10 to 14. I can't even. I have a 3 and a 5-year-old, and it just, that speaks for itself. So this probably won't be news to this group here. Ed schools and the spread of thought reform. The role of ed schools here was even greater than I thought. Education schools. We saw real problems with ed schools going back to the very early days of my career. They had a social justice requirement by the accrediting body of ed schools back in 2002, 2003, which is an obvious political litmus test, saying like, you're either with us or against us, and you need to show that you're with us in order to graduate. And we were able to defeat this from the accrediting body in 2005. But if you're already so far gone that nobody but fire is going to object to a political litmus test in your accrediting body's standards, you already have a lack of viewpoint diversity problem. So the reason why we're getting more involved in K through 12 is because students are showing up on campus already indoctrinated, already hostile to free speech, already morally certain of their political beliefs, usually sometimes made up by other people without them really realizing it, or sometimes with them very much realizing it. And we realized we couldn't defend free speech on campus without getting to students earlier. So this brings us to the rise of anti-CRT bills. Laws that bar teaching topics or concepts in higher education are almost always unconstitutional. Now here I'm going to try to go through the points I made along with Bonnie and 3 other authors in a 5,000-word piece we did analyzing this from a legal and philosophical standpoint. The fact that the battle against what's been dubbed CRT, I tend to actually think of it as, me and Haidt tend to use John McWhorter's Racism 3.0, is that by having bills initially that started with higher education, it was a bad start, because when you have bills that are specifically about targeting, ideas or concepts in higher education, they're unconstitutional, and just flat out. It's a very different analysis, though, when you get to K through 12. Not the same in K through 12, where teachers have limited free speech rights. Really, the free speech rights that teachers are supposed to have, to any degree, is just maybe off work. The protections of free speech aren't really meant to allow teachers to teach whatever they want. K through 12 curricula has always been political, and these bills haven't arisen out of nowhere. They are a response to legitimately concerning incidents. This was the part that got me in trouble. It's like, so you're saying this is CRT is really a problem? And it's like, of course it is. You shouldn't be teaching little kids to strongly identify with their race or to figure out what their gender is when they're 7. The bills only impact K through 12 may be constitutional, but there's a good reason to think that in their current form they might be unwise. They're a little too vague. They open themselves up to criticism because they open up themselves to criticism with this idea that it's an attempt to ban ideas. The clauses in many of the bills are vague and will show good faith, non-controversial teaching. Legislation isn't the only solution. Most conduct prescribed in the bills is already illegal and subject to lawsuits. For example, compelled speech under the 1943 case of West Virginia v. Barnett. If you've never read a legal opinion before, read this one. Racial discrimination and harassment are already barred by Title VI. Ethical guidelines for teachers bar mistreatment of students. Professional complaints are an option. There is a deep problem here that won't be solved by a negative curriculum. The negative curriculum idea is a lot of what we've been trying to do to address Racism 3.0 that's being passed by a lot of these schools or advocated by individual teachers is to say what you can't teach. And that, like I said, that opens you up to criticism about that it's actually, attempt to prevent teaching about slavery. And you see overly ambitious attempts to do things that seem unwise. it's important to have a positive vision of what you want to say rather than what you don't want people to say. And what I've done is I've created this list called the Empowering the American Mind that's all about positive ideas about what we want people to teach. But if you'll notice, none of these are compatible with the ideas of racism 3.0. So one, allow free speech, thought, and belief for all students. And this is something that I have to repeat. There are First Amendment concerns in K through 12, and they are almost exclusively with the students themselves. As far as the law is concerned, K through 12 teachers have very few free speech rights. I believe they actually should have greater rights off the job than they currently do. But on the job, they're not the ones who really matter in this case. It's the students themselves. And by the way, freedom of speech includes what you can't be compelled to say. You know, as bad as it is to tell people what they can't say, it's even worse to tell them what they must say, and absolutely unforgivable to tell them what they must think or believe. That's just not a free society anymore. Principle 2, respect individuality, dissent, and the sanctity of conscience. That's the Barnett idea. Principle 3, encourage curiosity, critical thinking skills, and discomfort with certainty. I've always loved this one because it makes perfect sense to those of us who believe in small L liberalism. But when you say this to students these days, it sounds like a Zen koan as far as they're concerned. And it's a talk called the Spirit of Liberty, given in 1944 by the great jurist Learned Hand. And the spirit of liberty is a spirit which is not too sure that it is right. The spirit of liberty is the spirit which seeks to understand the minds of other men and women. That's what I call epistemic humility. Demonstrate epistemic humility at all levels of teaching and policymaking. The teachers themselves should be aware of the fact that they should be modeling the fact that they don't understand the nature of the universe on any profound level, and very few of us, actually really do. And that essentially, you have to teach people to be. You need to teach teachers to actually model, things like the scientific method. And right now, if you're going in with an ideology, that means your mind is entirely made up on these topics. Foster independence, not moral dependency. Let grow. I introduced Lenore Skenazy to Jonathan Haidt and Daniel Schuckman, and they started a group called Let Grow that we talk a lot about in Coddling the American Mind. Lenore is who I got to see last night, was the creator of the free-range kids movement after she let her kid take the subway to get home when I think he was 8. Explain cognitive distortions and how to correct them. Now, this is my sort of passion project and has been for a long time, as I've been greatly helped by cognitive behavioral therapy. And all cognitive behavioral therapy really is teaching yourself to get in the habit of talking back to the crazy, exaggerated voices in your head. And so, for example, cognitive distortions, mind reading, fortune telling, catastrophizing, labeling, discounting positives. These are all things that if you do them a lot, you're going to be anxious and depressed. And I learned this the hard way myself. And you have to get in the habit of talking back to them. But the reason why I approached Haidt about writing Coddling the American Mind was because since I was working on campuses, I was looking at this going, it kind of seems like we're teaching a generation to engage in emotional reasoning, which is essentially your feelings always mean exactly what you think your feelings mean, and someone else has to do something about them. Blaming, dichotomous thinking, which is either or thinking. Overgeneralizing is a cognitive distortion. You might have run into a little bit of overgeneralizing among some of the professors and teachers that we're concerned about here. And so what I think is amazing is we do have, at multiple levels, people who are supposed to be educators saying, do blame, do overgeneralize, do engage in binary thinking, do engage in emotional reasoning. And this is a formula, again, it's illiberal. It's not a good formula for a democracy. But it's also a formula for a massive increase in anxiety and depression, which is precisely what happened when these ideas became much more popular on campus. It's a disaster on practically every front. Teach students why the three great untruths are wrong. This was sort of the framing of the book. At one point when we were writing the book, it was getting so in the weeds with things like, postmodernist thought and intersectionality. I told John, we are starting to write a book that I don't want to read anymore. So I tried to reframe it by basically doing what I thought we did right in the original article, which is talk about the opposite of wisdom. Basically, you can't necessarily tell people what they, and you probably shouldn't, tell them what they must do or must think, but pointing out, just like my Russian family, we will always give people advice in the opposite. Like I will talk to my sister Alexandra, and she'll complain about something, and we'll be like, you know what you should do, Alex? You should fixate on that anger, and you should make it your mission in life, and you should make sure that every morning you get up and plot your revenge. Because somehow, like saying it in the negative, just pointing out how bad an idea is sticks with people a lot of times better than pointing out what they really think they should do. So we have the framing of this is that we go to Greece, we go up Mount Olympus to talk to this allegedly great guru, and he tells me and John, what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. Always trust your feelings. And life is a battle between good people and evil people. And we don't tell people initially that the setup is, make-believe. And I've got so many people going like, you went to Greece that year? And it's like, no, it's pretty obvious this is a setup as far as I'm concerned. But my point is, so if these all sound manifestly ridiculous, like bad ideas to teach a generation, then why are we teaching a generation of students these ideas, is essentially the framing. So take student mental health more seriously. Sometimes people will just hear the title, Coddling the American Mind. I wanted to call the book Disempowered because I think it frames better what we're actually doing this generation, the harm that we're doing it. And I always try to be clear and people who haven't read it, they have all sorts of opinions, as you well know, about any number of things, and will oftentimes base their attack on the book clearly not having read it and say that like, oh, we just think that people are babies and need to suck it up. It's like, nope, it's all through the book that we actually need to take mental health more seriously. But what do I mean by that? I mean that currently we are devastating mental health in order to achieve political ends. There are students and professors who think it is politically useful for our society for students to experience tremendous guilt, tremendous shame, tremendous anger, a tremendous sense of being part of a group that's either blameworthy or victimized. And I mean, and if you look at the ideology of intersectionality as a lot of people understand it, most people are both oppressed and oppressor. So that's one of the reasons why I predicted pretty early on that some of the people who are going to be suffering the most would be women who believe in this, because they're both oppressed and oppressors. They're the very top of the oppression hierarchy in the bad way, but also still oppressed themselves. And right before we came out with the afterword, which we're now releasing in sections at my website, The Eternally Radical Idea, we got some data on what the mental health of self-described very liberal young women are. And at the moment, it's about 56%, a substantial majority, say that they have been told by a doctor that they have a mental health issue. And I do think that telling people that they're powerless, that they'll be harmed forever if they hear the wrong thing, that they're not very resilient, also that basically society is a conspiracy against you, and you, by the way, are guilty of all these horrendous evils that you didn't do personally. I mean, why wouldn't you be depressed? Avoid applying limiting labels to students. As you can see, what I'm doing here to a degree is one, defending old-fashioned liberalism in its real meaning, but also making things that are fundamentally incompatible with an aggressive identity politics idea, that also have the benefit of being true. And so the idea of teaching students to really fixate on superficial qualities of their skin color or what other people think they might be like, it's damaging, it's foolish, and it's illiberal. And if it's broke, fix it. I mean, sometimes people think that because I defend free speech on college campuses, I will bristle when they say, oh, we've got to get entirely out of the system. We've got to found new institutions. We've got to not fund universities in order to have huge staffs of administrators. And I'm like, amen. Now, I still believe we have to take what's going on in higher ed seriously, for example, because Harvard and Yale and Stanford and University and Princeton are all still going to be powerful 50 years from now. They shouldn't be as powerful as they are, but they're still going to be around. So you can't give up on them. Some of these fancy prep schools, maybe shouldn't be around too much longer. I got to speak at Exeter. Exeter will probably be around forever, given how much wealth they have. But we do need new institutions. We need changes to regulations that make it easier to set up alternatives to the existing model for K through 12. We really need to think big, and we need to get outside of the current system, because for some of these school districts, I'm not sure how it can be fixed other than just get out of the system and try new innovative approaches. My follow-up to Coddling the American Mind is a book called Uncoddle, which is going to be very much about solutions and talk to some people who are doing some really innovative stuff. I mean, I was impressed with how ambitious Sal Khan of Khan Academy is for what he wants to do with his Educate the World idea. There are some really cool K through 12 ideas out there. I know there's a lot of knowledge about this in this room. People are starting up brand new brick and mortar colleges, to compete with the big ones. So, now is the time to actually start innovating in this space. And surely what you come up with, if it just teaches kids to, read and do math, you're already outperforming most K through 12 these days. So I'm going to, if there's still time for questions, which I assume there is, which is one of the reasons why I went so fast. I'm good? Okay. A nation that doesn't educate in liberty will not long endure in liberty and will not even know when it's lost. That is from Alan Charles Kors, the co-founder of FIRE, also a scholar of the Enlightenment. And here is my contact info. Don't abuse it. That's my email address. That's me on Twitter. Shoot me questions if you have them. I will try to get back to you. Oh, and Bonnie Snyder, who most of you met last night. Can you stand up? So Bonnie Snyder runs our K through 12 outreach at FIRE. Like I said, a lot of you would have seen her last night because she spoke here. She just came out with a book called Undoctrinate that came out on September 14th, was it? That's about these very problems. So I'm not going to be here for much of the rest of the weekend, but if you're interested in FIRE, if you're interested in what we're doing, please see Bonnie and Molly, the FIRE VP who's sitting right next to her. Okay, I got through it all. They said it couldn't be done.
Greg Lukianoff. So I forgot to remind you earlier about the QC codes. You can scan and ask questions. Please do that going throughout the day. But if you want to ask questions, Paige was kind enough to say she'll run around with the microphone. But I want to ask you one to start off. You had a slide there that talked about some things that you can do beyond legislation. And you had this tremendous tweet all weekend. I've been talking about CRT and how we are losing the fight just by having that conversation. So I reached out to you. Remember, we're going to have that conversation because you had this long, sensible thread about CRT, the people on both sides.
Yeah.
So we have things you talk about that we can do, but I try to actually solve the problem. So sometimes my questions and my goals are lofty.
Yep.
So I want to know how we can get the people, forget about the things that we can do to help. How can we get the people who are yelling all this CRT stuff to actually focus on the things that they can do, because they're not even having that conversation. They're just yelling, it is CRT and it's not. So how do we even get the conversation shifted to what is actually happening in school? Because I don't see that a lot.
It's kind of funny because when you're talking about the people shouting about CRT, I'm like, well, which ones?
Yeah, all of them. I mean, all of them.
I have literally been attacked by both sides
Yep.
pretty aggressively, both from the left and the right on this, partially because I don't think that some of these, well, I mean, actually, it's not a question of don't think some of these laws are unconstitutional. Or unconstitutional. They are. I mean, I'm a First Amendment lawyer, but you don't have to be one to know that something that's very vague and particularly goes after ideas isn't constitutional under the First Amendment at a lot of colleges. But from the other side, this is one of the funny things about my take mental health more seriously. There was this guy, Michael Hobbs, who I'd never heard of before. But he, when we did this incredibly thoughtful 5,000-word piece that we were trying to break this down, he read something in a 36 tweet-long tweet storm where I mentioned legislators being concerned about mental health is understandable given there's been a real tanking of mental health for young people. A fact. And he meant that he read that, it's like, oh, he suddenly concerns about little white kids, and this, of course, a white dude, right. Feelings being hurt, but he's never cared about like minority feelings being hurt. And it's like, have you read my book? It's all about mental health. And the thing that was messed up about it was like, no, I'm actually saying this ideology is bad for everyone's mental health.
Right.
And they couldn't seem to wrap their heads around like the idea that
They take the piece that they want to see, and that's what they highlight.
Yeah, exactly. So I honestly, how you make progress here, the culture war, people put on their war hat so fast, and they just don't want to hear it. There's so little trust. I do think having more of this, in videos, having more of this actually shown, to mass audiences, which is already happening to a degree. But I defend freedom of speech, and you have to, put on your pants and fight every day for it. You have to explain it in a new and creative way over and over again. So I wish there was some easy solution to how do you get people to listen. One thing is the things that persuade people more than anything else are stories. The second thing that persuades people to a lesser degree than it should, but does, is data. But stories are more powerful many times over. So, she's left. I was going to mention the case in
and she's gone.
Yeah. It's an incredible case.
Yeah, definitely. He's talking about Gabs, right?
Yep.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think that's the case. But I think that people are, for whatever reason, I talk about the emotion, and your approach is good because it's strongly nonpartisan. Even though they want to push you from both sides in a certain direction, the book is not partisan, and most of the things that you say, it's just like, these are the facts, this is what's happening, what should you do? But you talk about the legislation being unconstitutional.
As applied to higher ed.
Right.
Yep.
But beyond that, it's like you talk about the vagueness of it. So because it's vague, how do you even enforce it, right? So you say you can't do this thing, and then they say, fine, we're going to keep doing what we're doing, and we'll just call it this other thing, and we're good.
Yeah, well, when it comes to vagueness and overbreadth, in a situation where it is unconstitutional, basically what you're doing is you're giving an administrator or representative on the ground the discretion to kind of do whatever they want with it. And in that situation, particularly at higher education, who do you think is going to be enforcing these rules? Right. It's going to be administrators who already are on the other side of the fence. But to be clear, I don't think these laws are unconstitutional as applied to K through 12. The state has a lot of power to decide what curriculum is for K through 12. It's for good democratic reasons. And the last thing you want is education school graduates deciding what little kids should be taught any more than they already are. Or actually, and that's one of the reasons why we have to profoundly rethink this stuff. When I talk about reform, and Haidt and I have both been kind of radicalized like in this way, I imagine setting up entirely new high schools where the only rule is nobody went to education schools who actually teach your kids.
Right.
And I think about this because I love history, and I always wanted to retire as a high school history teacher, because it's my hobby. But here was my belief, even when I was 12. Was that I couldn't go right into teaching kids because I had to live a life first. Mm-hmm. I had to have a career first. I had to know something about the real world first, and then I could teach after having a 20-year career or whatever. And what's astounding is by having these people who have their only experience is going directly through education, graduate school in some cases, is that it doesn't really reflect the real world. So if you were to have a school where everybody is someone who is on their second career and actually did things all over the spectrum and were actually mixed age, leaning more towards older, I think it would be incredibly more interesting. You'd get a lot more real world pragmatic advice. You wouldn't have the monomania, the focus on just a handful of things or just one thing that you have. So yeah, I think a lot about different models that you can create that would be better than the current system.
And you talk about stories being so important
yes.
too. The thing that all this yelling at each other, another thing that it doesn't do is no one tells great stories, but no one talks about the effect, right? So in all that, when you read all this stuff, we all see the stuff flying by as they did this, whatever. We get like Gap story, you get news stories that break through, that go national, but on the day-to-day conversation about this stuff, no one's just asking the simple question like, what is that gonna do to the kids?
Yeah.
So you wanna do this to 8-year-olds. Explain to me how that's helping their education, their mental health, and all these things. I don't see a lot of that, and I think that is great if people can say, just paint me a picture of where this leads. And you just ask the questions, and you'll be surprised by what people say. They don't really have an answer. If you ask an administrator or teacher, so how is this helping the 8-year-old? They don't have an answer.
Yeah.
It's like, well, this is what I was told to do, or this is what the others are doing, or this is the way we're going, but they don't tell you anything that actually helps.
Well, it's partially because they don't want to say what's true, is that they think it's going to lead to a political end that they think is a good end, despite the lack of education, despite the harm to mental health, despite the disempowerment. And they don't want to actually say that out loud. And of course, even those political ends that they say that they're trying to get to, they're also not going to achieve those.
Right.
It's just going to turn into a situation where you really, one of the things that was fun in coddling was talking about how incredibly easy it is to create people seeing another group as an outgroup. You can randomly assign blue and red t-shirts and people become fiercely loyal to that group within like 15 minutes. Right. So the idea that we're doing this where we're really doubling down on very precise sort of academic ideas of good versus evil at a young age, it's a disaster.
Right, right. My approach is always saying that they're trying to control human nature what they can. So they're going to pull the reins, but then at some point they're going to lose control. So they're not going to be able to, they think they know the outcome, but they can't control the outcome, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's the problem. I think we have a question over here.
Yeah, thank you.
Stands.
Oh, there you go.
He's
This
over
one, you want me to go? Okay.
the lights, we can't see.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I wasn't going to say this, but since you brought it up, I am working on that kind of high school out in New York City area.
Oh, there, okay.
Yeah. My question was this, though, and I know you get this a lot, but I want to ask it anyway. Does FIRE have the interest or desire to be the new ACLU, which would mean going beyond education? Because I know, you've got media coverage that have talked about that. I'm curious to hear you talk about that.
Boy, is this online? Is this being
Yes,
being
yes,
taped?
it is. Yes. Yes. People
That's always a good way to start explaining something. You know what I mean? Kind of like, is this online? We do actually get asked that a lot. We still work with the ACLU in different cases. I come from an ACLU background. I worked at the ACLU of Northern California back in '99. Unfortunately, even then, like the free speech department there was considered not that cool, which was very disappointing. I worked with Michelle Alexander, who wrote the new Jim Crow, and we all were just in awe of her. Am I going to say that we're? I think the sad truth is that if the ACLU was doing a better job on campus, there wouldn't have been a need for FIRE in the first place. And we do this work almost entirely. Do I think that there's a probability that we'll be expanding out? We're reaching out more to K through 12. Bonnie was actually really kind of a first step in that direction. We'll probably be growing that department, but is there demand for us, to do more for the entire society? Yes. And one thing that I want to do more of, and I think I think that a lot of times lawyers think litigation is the only answer to things. And to be frank, the state of the law for First Amendment is actually really quite good. The law is very, very protective of freedom of speech in the United States. That's not where the problem is. The problem is with the culture. And one of the things that I'm trying to do, there's a limited amount that I can divulge about this, but do a gigantic public education campaign on freedom of speech, reframing it like I did in the beginning, explaining just the basics about like, no, this is for minority rights, and you're not being told that because the people actually in charge are acting exactly like the people who are actually in charge always act. So doing a gigantic public education campaign is something that we're considering. Does that mean we might be, contributing in a way to something that we feel like is currently neglected? Yeah, I would say so. But Nadine Strawson's a good friend. Ira Glasser, we did a documentary about the old head of the ACLU who'd been the executive director for 25 years. We did a movie called Mighty Ira about his life and times. And Harvey Silverglate, who was a co-founder of FIRE, is an ACLU of Massachusetts guy. So slightly evasive, but by necessity.
You have a question where?
Well, I was going to say something,
for future announcements.
I was going to say exactly what he did. So just competition is great. FIRE and ACLU work together when you can, and do what you do, they do what they do, and the more choices out there, the better. The more people protecting this, the better. So thank you.
Oh, that was your question? Oh, great. Okay.
I remember.
Hi.
Susie.
Hi. So this is more of a legal question.
Sure.
It seems to me that critical social justice is not just a perspective, because it relies on this idea of praxis, right? The practical application sort of demands it. It's inextricably intertwined with the set of beliefs. So it's functioning like a religion, but yet those who believe in it aren't calling it a religion. It has all the hallmarks of religion. And in public schools and other secular institutions, it's not okay to be, not have this sort of separation. So how, from a legal perspective, can people go in and make that legal argument, even if its adherents and proponents don't necessarily proclaim it to be a religion?
And I get this question a lot, and the answer is, I think if you were to go into court making the argument that this ideology is a religion, it would be tough. It would be tough to win on that. And it's not to say that there isn't similarities, and actually sometimes, frankly, I think this almost behaves more like a superstition than a religion. But, you know, it does have this kind of good versus evil idea, this idea of the, you know, a final state, all of these kind of things that are usually associated with religion. If you were going to try to make the argument that this is a sort of secular religion, there is some case law that you could probably rely on to some degree, but it would be a risky legal approach. It is my main point. And it hasn't really been. It's been tried to a degree in the cases of conscientious objectors. That you've had situations where people said, "Listen, I don't believe in God, but one of my deepest core beliefs is that I shouldn't." I won't kill anybody. I cannot go to war. I would rather die than kill. And the Supreme Court, in at least one case, said that was still functioning as a secular religion. So there is kind of an opening. I tend to be pretty small c conservative with my legal theories because I'm much more worried about getting a bad case on the books when the state of the law otherwise for what I do, it is so good. So I think that if people are really going to try the religion, this is a religion approach, with my lawyer hat on, they got to be really careful how they do it. And they got to be really thorough, and they've got to be able to say, to really prove that this plays the function of religious belief in the individuals' lives who actually teach this. And like I said, I'm not saying it's not possible. I think it is possible, and I think there's been some case law that shows that it could be. It just isn't a slam dunk.
We have one here. The button.
Yeah, I have a question as a K-12 educator myself. So I know that I don't have free speech in what I teach. I know that I'm under contract to teach, to the children what the school committee requires me to teach.
Yeah.
But what kind of rights do I have as an opinion? So if a child asks me, so what do you think about CRT?
Oof.
And I give my opinion,
Yeah.
right? If I actually, and I probably wouldn't because I would be afraid of what would happen, but let's say I do give my opinion,
Yeah.
what kind of free speech rights would I have or protections at all?
The latest case law on the rights of K through 12 teachers in the classroom is pretty uniformly, it's very weak. There are very weak protections. Now, there's two sides to that, though. It means that if you had a district where they had a curriculum that was more like the one we're recommending, it would mean that a teacher who's constantly saying, "By the way, I think this is all BS," couldn't say that was just my on-the-job speech that's protected by the First Amendment. I don't think they'd win that suit. When it comes to sharing your opinion, like in class, that contradicts the curriculum. Honestly, I don't know where that case would fall out, to be honest. I particularly think that given there's this kind of compelled speech idea that you can't be, made to say things that conflict with your deepest core beliefs, that also runs you into trouble in the other direction, because then people, if you try to have a small L liberal curriculum and someone says, well, I think this is all wrong, and I believe that race is destiny and all this kind of stuff, that that there's kind of no system that wouldn't cut in the other direction too that could be a problem. So. And again, I'm not specialized for K through 12, but the case law is not favorable for the classroom free speech rights of teachers. Fortunately in some cases, unfortunately in others. And I always try to remind people that the reason why it's not is very explicitly because we wanted this, since it's mandatory school, since you're required to go to school below a certain age, this being part of the democratic process is essential. And I'm blown away by people actually saying, essentially, this should be entirely in the hands of people who graduate from education schools deciding what should be taught. But the kind of serious change in the way we look at it when it's mandatory education in a democracy, it comes with all sorts of strings that can cut in either direction, both for bad and for good.
Over here.
I have a question about how administrators at these elite, really wealthy private schools respond when have you had conversations with them? I've just found I've spent my entire career in wealthy private boarding schools, and sometimes the administration can be incredibly difficult to have an open conversation with.
Yeah. Prior to COVID, I was speaking, I usually speak on campuses, but I was making a point of speaking at these disproportionately influential private schools, which some part of me bristles at that, you know. I didn't come from any amount of money, you know, it was kind of a surprise that I went to college at all, and then things kind of worked out. But I have come to realize that Andover has greater influence on the future of the country than people expect. Same thing with Exeter, same thing with Choate, a lot of these schools. And I used to be invited to speak there, and I would talk to the parents the night before, then I'd talk to the students the next day, and they've never heard this free speech stuff that I'm talking about. And they're like, wow, you know, like, oh my God, I should think of censorship as something like, what would my worst enemy do with that same power? And it's like, yes, that's the most basic thing you need to know about free speech, and the fact that it's blowing your mind is a bad sign. I do think a lot of these schools have been, well, I mean, no secret here, have been really bad actors. I think the idea that they want to, in some cases, hide the curriculum from parents is horrifying. I think we only know so much about this because COVID forced the people to learn at school so parents could see it. I mean, honestly, the person who knows more about this than me, Bonnie, in terms of what do you recommend for trying to get the truth out of, I mean, honestly, I think that a big part of it is the people who are starting up independent, highly rigorous, super competitive, you know, private school models like in New York City. I think there'd be a line through the door at this point. I know that some of you are trying stuff like this, but I think that I think people literally have to stop giving money. They have to walk out. They have to find new ways of doing it pretty much right away. Because when that trust is gone, when the idea that like you're going to not even tell me if you're doing some of these things, that's not salvageable. But, yeah, no, it's horrifying.
I often say is the difference between there's bad lessons and then there's bad people, and bad people are the ones who are lying to you, and that's really unsalvageable, that situation. Caveat emptor, if you're looking at a school, in private school, that's a contractual arrangement, you know, let the buyer beware, and people need to vote with their feet. The problem that I'm hearing is that, well, a couple of things. I mean, kids are effectively hostages. If you have a high school junior or a senior, what are you going to do? You're going to break them away from their whole peer group, interfere with their college applications, and schools are, you know, much to their shame, utilizing that to hold people in these arrangements. But, you know, when your kids are younger, you do have more choice. And then there is the status that is involved with the private schools. Yeah, I think maybe there is plenty of room for something between public and private that, you know, I guess charters are, there's no easy answer here. I liked what Ian Rowe said about there's a macro problem with micro solutions. Mm-hmm. And I think it's going to be multi-pronged and crowdsourced. Yeah, and this is one of the reasons why I'm talking to a lot of people who are innovating in the higher education space. Because, you know, one of the things, more than being a First Amendment lawyer, almost more, one of the things that really affected the way I think about this is being an employer. We have about 70 people, I think, around there at FIRE now. That's a lot of growth pretty recently. And if someone went to one of these fancy schools, I would say to myself, I still have that, like, you know, fancy schools, old habits are hard to break. You could be pretty much assured that they were pretty smart and they were pretty hardworking, and that's it. They didn't necessarily know stats, they couldn't necessarily write, they didn't necessarily understand anything about the world or history. And now it's actually starting to bend in the direction of, and we're hearing from companies all over the country, and they're showing up with attitudes that are dysfunctional for the workplace, that essentially every small conflict has to go immediately to the HR department. And of course, people from companies all over the country are coming to me in Height saying this, but then also saying, but I can't say what company I'm talking about, because they're afraid of their own employees. But for example, the HR department of all of Bank of America had me talk, and then every time I felt like I was in East Germany or something like that, because they'd be like whispering, it's like, yeah, this is a problem. Thanks for explaining this to people. But I do think there's an opportunity there. One, I think people should be more public about what I've heard from people in charge of some really big, important companies saying, listen, I'm just not going to hire people from some of these schools anymore, because it's just coming too dysfunctional. I'm going to hire more people from state schools. So what I'm saying is making different systems that really focus on what
would be more competitive for employers to want in the long run. The ones that actually have, you can hire them knowing they're smart, hardworking, and know statistics, and understand world history, and know a little about law, and know about the way the country runs. I think there is some big opportunities here. So I do think that you know, an apolitical, highly rigorous model, I think there's lots of opportunities for that now, and there's desperate need for it.
Question here.
Yeah, so as also a K-12 teacher, and in light of what you said about catching kids before they get to university, does FIRE have a free speech curriculum, or are there plans to create one?
We do.
Okay, for K-12.
For K-12, yep.
Awesome.
We do. Yeah, and Bonnie,
Yeah,
get
see
a
us
card
at
from
the
Bonnie right
table.
away. And I want us to not just have a K through 12 curriculum. I want us to have multiple ones, because, you know, I have this weird kind of like constitutional law and psychology, you know, hobby thing, and I think that it allows for so many different ways to approach these issues that could be super interesting. And just the same way we have a free speech orientation for higher education, I'd love to be able to have multiple products, so to speak, depending on the needs of the particular school.
Bruce,
I have no idea what time
you
it
got to
is.
enunciate. She's telling me I'm fine, so.
I think part of the battle, obviously, is building awareness, which is what you've done and what this conference is trying to do.
Yep.
What ultimately would your call to action be for concerned parents at this point? What is the next step? What should people leave this room and go out and do?
I changed, originally the empowering of the American mind idea was, you know, it was just me spitballing more or less. I was getting so many questions about this. But then I realized what I was trying to achieve was a positive vision, so I actually reworded it somewhat since the handout you have, to make sure that everything is not don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, it's do this, do this, do that. And I think probably a first step, frankly, is to try to treat, do you know what the Chicago Statement is? Mm-hmm. So the Chicago Statement is something that University of Chicago came out with in 2015. I'm very proud to say we were consulted on it. And it was talking about academic freedom standards for the age of cancel culture, for the age of 2015 disinvitation type problems. And we've helped get about 60 to 70 schools adopt the Chicago Statement. It's been a great team building exercise. People have to raise their hands. I think probably a good place to start, and you know, I'm pitching my own stuff, but this is why I created it, is to have something, it doesn't have to be my stuff, but it's already prepared, have something like the Chicago Statement. Present that to the deans of some of these schools, the presidents of some of these schools, and I'm willing to bet a lot of them will tell you politely to go to hell, or just ignore it. But that's information all by itself. There will be others who are like, you know, if we do all this stuff, are the donations going to start coming back again? You know, you're going to have some presidents who are going to start to listen to that. I think it's definitely found new institutions, but at the same time put the ones in the old institutions on the spot pretty aggressively. Basically say, like, listen, and the reason why, like, I did like this approach is because, so you're saying we shouldn't be teaching them about individuality or the right of personal conscience, or that you shouldn't be labeling people, because it's hard to object to any of these principles, because they're all just old-fashioned liberal values on which I mean, like in the old sense, that the country is founded on. So I think the time for having, it doesn't have to be mine, but something like the Chicago Statement for K through 12, getting that in front of teachers ASAP, actually the heads of schools ASAP, and you're going to get some really bad responses to it. You're going to have people coming back saying, you know, utterly dismissive, saying that, you know, trying to dismiss anybody who opposes CRT is obviously, you know, just as bad as the Proud Boys or something like that. But that's great information to have on its own, and I'm willing to bet there'll at least be some who's like, oh, thank goodness, like, I think my teachers are nuts, and I'm going to blame the new statement we just signed on reining them in. FIRE, by the way, does that a lot, is that I get invited to schools sometimes and to give, like, the bad news, and then when I actually talk to the teachers and presidents and top deans, they're like, oh, thank you. We wanted you to say it, essentially. You know, you know, and I'm like, what, because you were scared? And the answer is,
Go ahead, Ashley.
Parents Unite actually started with the premise that the accreditation agencies should work with all the private schools to create their own version of Chicago Statement.
Yeah.
That was our whole reason for being.
oh, I didn't know that.
Yes, and we started with a letter, May 11th, to all the accreditors asking for that. And guess what the response was?
Yes, they were all psyched about it, I bet.
Well, we're
They
here.
said, thank you, but we're already doing a great job in this vein, so see you later.
Yeah.
We responded and said, well, it turns out we're not seeing that. They responded basically saying, go away. And so here we are.
Right, and that's why we're here.
And you just got to keep punching away. I mean, and the local regulations about accreditation, I mean, the accreditation agencies are part of the problem. That's why I'm not pretending this is an easily solved thing. So keep on putting them on the spot. Make sure that what you're putting on the spot with is aggressively reasonable, hard to disagree with. Make sure that everybody in the media knows that they're giving this stuff up. Now, of course, the media handling of this is really troubling. Batya Ungar Sargon is coming out with a book called Bad News it's actually an interesting framing because it's a critique of modern media from the left, but saying that essentially since now, only rich kids can afford to go to journalism school and live on $40,000 a year in New York City. So it's become a situation where it's just elite educated, very upper class people. And what Batya has done, which I think is not just clever, it's correct, is say like, listen, this is a betrayal of everybody outside of the top 5%. And I think that the reforms even have to happen in the journalism space in order to make this possible. But like I said, there's no easy solution, but constantly putting deans on the spot and presidents on the spot and being willing to, I mean, I have a 3 and a 5-year-old, so I don't imagine any of this stuff as being easy at all. I know this is going to probably be a battle that's going to get me hated by a lot of parents, and that saddens me, to be frank. But we got to fight it because these are dysfunctional ideologies to teach kids, and it's going to make the habit of overgeneralization worse, and it's going to have very negative long-term consequences.
Well, Greg, I'm going to ask you one quick question at the end, but I want to say Beth Feely spoke yesterday, and she talked about the Chicago statement. She got it implemented in New Trier in Wilmette. So
and I spoke at New Trier.
Yeah, so we are having some wins. And the other thing I'd say parents should do is they need to talk to other parents. Like the example you gave about the businesses where they whisper things about HR. You don't talk to parents. You talk to parents about parenting and their kids and their friends. But if you talk to them about and say, hey, what do you think about what they're doing? They're like, well, I was afraid to say it. I thought I was the only one. But now you're saying it.
Yep.
Yeah, it is kind of bad. So, I mean, you got to, keep talking to people whenever you get a chance. So my simple question is this. You and I talk before. I tell you I buy your book and I give it to people because it's so good. I can only buy so many. So are there
you
any
sure,
places?
though?
Can you really? No, but is there any places that are actually using the book, I don't know, higher ed or even K through 12, that are actually using, any teachers that are using that book, either from a mental health standpoint or from a free speech standpoint, saying, here is something we can use that talks about the issue in a really smart way?
I definitely, I hear from a lot of K through 12 teachers and people in higher ed who use the book in their classes. I have also heard that students are so trained to respond to this. I mean, one of them was a class, because we've trained all these habits of just dismissing each other, and I call it the perfect rhetorical fortress that we've created, and we're teaching this advanced technique for dismissing actual substantive arguments to 10-year-olds. And of course, they're like running with it, and because it means they always win. But it was amazing to see some of the responses from someone who was trying to teach coddling, and they was sending me tweets of what students had said. And one of them was flat out, this person knows nothing about, about mental health issues or suffering. And my actual struggles with this is central to the whole book, so it's all in there. So I do think, the next book is going to be much more focused on actual solutions. But in terms of the stuff that we wrote in coddling, I do think that it's a good way to sort of, talking about cognitive distortions is sort of a way to sort of sneak in the old rules of argumentation. Don't overgeneralize, don't label, don't engage in binary thinking. It's just plain good advice. And I think pointing out that this isn't just, for better critical thinking skills, this is for mental health, which is also true, is a good way to get in the door, because there is a mental health crisis. And the one thing that I let myself get angry about is there is no question that the students who are hitting campuses have higher suicide rates, higher depression, higher self-harm. The last time we saw anything even this close was in the early 1980s, and it's already worse than that. This is the worst we've seen it. And nonetheless, they're having students get on campus or in K through 12 and say, I know, I'm sorry to hear you're sad and anxious, but by the way, you're an oppressor. There's nothing you can do about this. You will be harmed permanently by words if you hear things that hurt you. You're both oppressor and oppressed, and all of this kind of stuff. It just seems, at some level, particularly since it's because they ultimately think it will achieve some political end down the line, there's a nastiness and cruelty to the whole thing. So I do think that the idea of take your kid's mental health more seriously, find out the arguments being made in Coddling the American Mind and whatever. I mean, the original article that we wrote in 2015 might be a little more helpful. But really, like, yes, this is about mental health, but what you're doing is obviously going to make it worse, is a good angle to take.
Well, it's also funny that, you know, in the culture, if you following their lead, the culture is all about my truth. Any truth that person has, you have to believe it. So you were telling your own story, yet they're telling you that you don't know what you're talking about. You're not.
Authenticity is an argument that's sort of fallen out of favor. Like, people don't make free speech arguments related to authenticity as much as they have for most of my life. And I think that we should get back to making authenticity-based arguments, that essentially it's always important to know what people really think, full stop.
He is Greg Lukianoff, and you're
Can I just make one quick comment about the mental health? You know, often it's through the social emotional learning programs that a lot of this stuff gets into school. So it's just something, I'm sure many people know that, but it's definitely ironic that that's actually the source of what is becoming most
We have a
toxic
panel
for our
coming up later
kids.
on that.
Yeah.
Well, great. What a setup. Thank you.
I don't know if that was you, but I did hear from someone who was a big advocate of the social emotional learning stuff, and it was utterly horrified that it's been repurposed in a way that meant to spread ideology. Okay.
Well, he is Greg Lukianoff, the president of FIRE. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles.